Imagine you're on a quiet walk when suddenly a runaway trolley comes into view, barreling down the tracks. As it approaches, you notice a group of 5 people trapped in its path, unable to escape. Then, you see a lever nearby that could switch the trolley to another track, avoiding the 5 people. But there's a man on this alternative track who would not survive if you pulled the lever. You're thrust into a moral quandary. Should you do nothing and let the trolley continue toward the 5, or pull the lever, saving them all? But at the cost of a single life. It's a bleak decision with no ideal outcome, yet the instinct to protect the greater number may prompt you toward pulling that lever, trading 1 life for 5. Many will grapple with this act itself, finding it more difficult to accept their own responsibility for pulling the lever and causing 1 death, rather than letting things play out and harming 5 people through inaction. This discomfort with taking harmful actions over allowing harm to just happen is a phenomenon known as the omission bias. In our daily lives, we generally want to do what's right, to help rather than harm, and often hold a sense of altruism that guides our choices. When faced with moral judgments, however, biases can cloud our thinking, distorting the ethical barometer we rely on. Omission bias inclines us to see actions as worse than omissions, even when both lead to harm and are underpinned by similar intentions. We judge actions harshly because they feel more like deliberate choices, while omissions seem like passive states that may not even register as choices at all. Yet philosophers argue that this distinction isn't as firm as it feels. In the case of the runaway trolley, there are numerous reasons we could fail to pull the lever, from fear to hesitation, while choosing to pull it to save 5 lives seems a narrower, more specific choice. This distinction between action and omission begins to seem arbitrary upon closer examination. This bias shapes how we view others and influences our personal choices, often allowing us to rationalize our own inaction while judging others' actions more critically. But choosing inaction sidesteps accountability, a position we can mistakenly see as more ethical because we technically didn't do anything. The implications of omission bias go beyond individual choices. They ripple out through institutions and systemic structures. In healthcare, omission bias can have profound consequences. Take the case of organ donation. In the US, individuals must actively choose to opt in to be organ donors. Under this opt-in system, donation rates are significantly lower compared to countries with an opt-out policy, where people are assumed to be donors unless they explicitly refuse. In these opt-out countries, organ donation rates soar, sometimes reaching 100%. The difference in outcome highlights how powerful omission bias is. By framing inaction as the default opt-out, the moral calculus of choosing inaction shifts, and more people end up donating organs simply by virtue of not having to make an explicit decision. The reason omission bias feels so natural to us may partly lie in our aversion to loss. When we act and things go poorly, it's easy to see our actions as failures, resulting in a sense of loss. However, if we choose inaction and things go badly, it feels less like an active loss and more like a missed chance or an unfortunate outcome. Consider the example of an investor who holds shares in one stock but debates switching to another. If the investor doesn't act and the new stock outperforms, the regret is likely mild. It was a missed gain rather than a tangible loss. However, if the investor sells and the original stock soars, it feels like an acute loss, amplifying regret and self-blame. Loss aversion in these scenarios magnifies our perception of risk associated with taking action, bolstering the inclination to stick with inaction as the safer path. This inaction bias extends beyond personal choices into our judgments of others, such as in professional sports. Data from baseball and basketball games reveal that umpires and referees often avoid making game-changing calls in the final moments, knowing these will directly impact the outcome. For instance, basketball referees call fewer fouls at critical game points to avoid the perception that they're deciding the game's outcome. The omission bias can pressure officials to withhold judgments, prioritizing neutrality over accuracy, which in turn may deprive players and teams of fair officiation. While it's easy to overlook, our tendency to default to inaction has real-world consequences. Even in intimate relationships, omission bias may justify white lies or withholding uncomfortable truths, believing that silence or inaction is morally less damaging than an explicit lie. We may think it's kinder not to say anything negative or painful to avoid causing hurt, yet these omissions can lead to deeper misunderstandings and strain. The problem lies in our over-reliance on this mental shortcut. While it's a useful cognitive tool to avoid harm, overuse in complex situations can create blind spots, leading us to underestimate the importance and impact of inaction. Understanding and countering omission bias has the potential to bring about meaningful change, particularly in public policy. As seen in the case of organ donation, governments can subtly shift public behaviours for the better by making inaction harder to justify. Similarly, framing environmental choices as opt-out rather than opt-in options could nudge more people towards sustainable practices. By reframing choices to account for this bias, society can help foster decisions that promote overall well-being, even when people don't take an explicit action. At an individual level, recognizing and reflecting on our own omission biases can guide us toward better, more responsible choices. It's helpful to examine moments in our daily lives where omission bias might be at work, questioning whether inaction truly serves the best outcome. In the case of studying, for example, committing to a scheduled study session with friends can make avoiding studying feel like a conscious, deliberate choice to be cancelled, thus encouraging follow-through. Without such arrangements, we might justify skipping study time as a harmless omission, allowing us to rationalize procrastination more easily. Illustrative examples highlight the omission bias in various scenarios. In the anti-vaccine movement, parents sometimes refuse vaccinations due to perceived risks, ignoring data that shows non-vaccination leads to far worse outcomes. A study found that parents hesitant to vaccinate believed vaccination posed a greater threat than inaction, even when statistics disproved this. Their omission bias led them to assume that opting out was safer, showing how our minds favor inaction, even when it's objectively riskier. In the end, omission bias is deeply woven into our psychology, our systems, and our society, shaping decisions big and small. Recognizing it enables us to make more deliberate, conscious choices and to better understand the moral weight of inaction. Whether through personal introspection or systemic change, we can work to avoid the pitfalls of omission bias and foster a more ethically nuanced understanding of the choices we make, or choose not to make every day. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.